The stories traveled faster than autumn winds through the villages that bordered Shadow Vale. Another farm destroyed, livestock slaughtered, and deep, terrible claw marks scored into wooden doors. The beast had struck again, leaving fear and whispers in its wake. She came in the night, the trembling farmer told Lyndon as the healer dressed his wounds. Eyes like burning coals in the darkness. Taller than any person ought to be, with scales that turned aside my pitchfork like it was nothing more than a twig. Lyndon nodded solemnly, his gentle hands wrapping a poultice around the man's lacerated arm. At 26, he had already earned a reputation throughout the region as a healer who listened more than he spoke, who sought understanding before judgment. His auburn hair was often tied back in a simple knot, practical for his work, and his eyes, a deep forest green, seemed to hold wisdom beyond his years. Did she speak? Lyndon asked, securing the bandage. The farmer looked at him as though he'd suggested the moon might fall from the sky. Speak? The beast doesn't speak, boy. It roars and destroys. It's a demon, not a person. Every creature has a voice, Lyndon replied softly, more to himself than to the injured man. Sometimes we just haven't learned how to listen. That night, in his small cottage at the edge of the village of Elmhaven, Lyndon pored over his collection of books by candlelight. Tales of curses, of transformations, of beings neither human nor beast. Some called the creature of Shadow Vale Thora, though none knew if this had always been her name or if it had been given to her out of fear. In the old tongue, it meant Thunderbringer. For 3 years, the villages had lived in terror of Thora's attacks. Sometimes months passed without incident, leading people to hope she had moved on or died. Then suddenly, violently, she would return. Never killing humans, Lyndon had noticed, though she had the strength to do so easily. Only destroying property, stealing food, and injuring those who stood in her way. There's a pattern here, he murmured, marking locations on a crude map. She's not random in her attacks. His apprentice, a serious girl of 14 named Elspeth, looked over his shoulder. You sound like you admire her, Master Lyndon. Not admire, he corrected gently. Understand. There's a difference. I suspect Thora isn't attacking out of malice, but desperation. Notice how her appearances coincide with the harshest weather, the coldest nights. Elspeth frowned. The headman has called for hunters from the capital. They're offering 50 gold pieces for her head. Lyndon's hand tensed around his quill. That will only lead to more bloodshed. He stood abruptly, rolling up his map. Watch over things here. I need to gather herbs from the western meadows. Now? In the dark? Elspeth's eyes widened with understanding. You're going to find her. Lyndon met her gaze steadily. Some herbs can only be harvested by moonlight. That's not true and you know it, she retorted, but handed him his traveling cloak nonetheless. You can't save everyone, Lyndon. Some monsters are just monsters. He smiled sadly as he fastened the worn leather satchel to his belt. And some are made, not born. Keep the door barred until morning. The night air was crisp with approaching winter as Lyndon followed the trail of destruction to the edge of Shadow Vale. Ancient trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches creating patterns against the star-strewn sky. Normal people avoided these woods even before Thora made them her domain. Local legends spoke of old magic here, of boundaries between worlds growing thin among these gnarled trunks. Lyndon moved with purpose, following not just the obvious signs of broken branches and disturbed earth, but subtler clues, drops of dark liquid that his experienced eye recognized as blood. Not human blood. Whatever Thora was, she was injured. A low growl stopped him in his tracks. Something massive shifted in the shadows ahead. The moonlight caught the gleam of scales, the curve of claws that could shred a man with a single swipe. Thora, Lyndon said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. I am not here to harm you. The growl deepened, and then came words, rough, painful, as though dragged through a throat not meant for human speech. Healer. I smell the herbs on you. Lyndon slowly removed his hood, letting her see his face clearly in the moonlight. Yes. I've come to help you, if you'll allow it. A bitter, rasping sound that might have been laughter. Help the monster? They sent you to poison me. No one sent me, he replied, carefully setting down his satchel and opening it to reveal its contents. I came because I believe there's more to your story than others are willing to hear. The massive shape moved closer, and for the first time, Lyndon beheld Thora fully. She stood nearly 8 feet tall, her body a hybrid of human and something ancient and reptilian. Scales covered most of her form, midnight blue darkening to black along her spine. A ridge of spines ran from her head down her back. Her face retained some human features, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, but her eyes glowed amber in the darkness, vertical pupils dilating as she studied him. Most terrifying was the wound in her side, a deep gash that leaked a viscous dark fluid. A trap, Lyndon realized. Someone had managed to injure the seemingly invincible beast. Why? Would you help? Thora rasped, swaying slightly from blood loss. Lyndon met her gaze without flinching. Because pain is pain, whether in man or beast. And I suspect there's much more to you than the stories say, Thora of Shadow Vale. She tensed at the name, her clawed hand reaching toward him, whether to strike or steady herself, he couldn't tell. Then, with a sound like the sighing of ancient trees, she collapsed to the forest floor. Lyndon worked swiftly as Thora lay unconscious before him, her massive form rising and falling with labored breaths. The trap that had caught her was designed with cruel ingenuity, barbed metal that tore further when removed. He cleaned the wound with water from his flask, applied a poultice of yarrow and comfrey, and bound it with strips of linen he'd brought for gathering herbs. Who did this to you? He murmured, though she couldn't hear him. Up close, her scales held an iridescent quality, shimmering dark blue in the moonlight. Despite her fearsome appearance, there was something almost regal in the lines of her face. Dawn was breaking when Thora's eyes fluttered open, instantly alert and dangerous. She lunged upward, then fell back with a hiss of pain. Careful, Lyndon cautioned, maintaining a safe distance. The wound is deep. You'll reopen it if you move too quickly. Why? Am I not dead? Her voice was clearer now, though still rough with disuse. I'm a healer, not a killer, he replied simply. And I've never believed the stories told about you. Thora's laugh was a harsh, broken sound. What do they say of me now? That I devour children? Burn villages for sport? Something like that, Lyndon admitted. Though I've noticed you've never actually killed anyone. Her amber eyes narrowed. Perhaps I've eaten the witnesses. Then you're remarkably tidy about it. He offered her water from his flask. After a suspicious pause, she accepted, the liquid disappearing in a single swallow. You should leave, healer. Before I recover my strength. Lyndon sat cross-legged on the forest floor. My name is Lyndon. And I don't think you'll hurt me. Bold assumption. Her claws flexed, glinting dangerously. You've had plenty of chances to slaughter humans. You choose not to. That suggests restraint. Purpose. He leaned forward slightly. The villages think you attack randomly, but I've charted your movements. You're searching for something, aren't you? The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Finally, Thora shifted, adjusting her position against a large tree trunk. What healer plays detective with monster sightings? One who believes understanding is as important as healing. Lyndon began unpacking more supplies, food, fresh bandages. The wound will need tending for several days. I'll return tonight. I won't be here. Then I'll track you again. He stood, brushing leaves from his clothing. Rest. Eat. The meat is smoked, it will keep. As he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. Why risk yourself, human? Your kind fears what they don't understand. They'll turn on you if they discover this kindness. Lyndon glanced back at her, silhouetted against the morning light filtering through the trees. Perhaps. But I'd rather be right and alone than wrong in company. When he returned that night, he half expected her to be gone. Instead, she waited in a small clearing, sitting with her back against an ancient oak, watching him approach with wary eyes. Your bandages need changing, he said by way of greeting. Wordlessly, she allowed him to work, his hands deft and gentle against her scaled skin. The wound looked cleaner, already beginning to heal at an extraordinary rate. You recover quickly, he observed. A dubious gift, she replied. It prolongs this existence. As he applied fresh herbs, he ventured carefully, the villagers call you Thora. Is that your name? Something flickered across her features, pain that had nothing to do with physical wounds. Once, perhaps. Names hold power. Mine was taken, along with much else. Then what shall I call you? She considered this, as though the concept of being addressed was foreign. Thora will do. It's as true as anything else now. Their strange routine continued for 5 nights. Lyndon would come at dusk, bringing food and fresh supplies. He would tend her rapidly healing wound, and each night, she revealed small fragments of herself. How she'd learned to hunt in the forest. The cave system where she sheltered during the harshest weather. Her preference for the taste of rabbit over deer. On the 5th night, as Lyndon was preparing to leave, a distant horn sounded through the trees. Thora tensed immediately, rising to her full height. Monster hunters, she growled, the spines along her back lifting. Your village grows impatient for my head. They're not from my village, Lyndon said, hastily gathering his supplies. The headman must have sent to the capital as threatened. Thora's eyes gleamed in the darkness. Go now, healer. Our paths must part. I can help you hide. No. Her voice was firm. They will kill you for consorting with a monster. I will lead them away from here. Thora. 5 nights you have shown me kindness, she said, her massive form already melting into the shadows. I repay it by sparing you from what comes next. Forget me, Lyndon. He stood alone in the clearing, the horn calls growing closer, and knew in his heart he could not obey her last command. Lyndon refused to heed Thora's warning. Instead of returning to the village, he tracked her through Shadow Vale, following faint signs that others would miss, a bent twig, disturbed moss, the occasional scale glinting in moonlight. The hunter's horns grew distant as Thora led them on a false trail while she moved deeper into the forest's heart. 3 days passed before Lyndon found her again. She had retreated to a place few dared venture, the hollow, a ravine cut deep into the earth, where ancient stone ruins jutted from the mist like broken teeth. Locals whispered that old magic lingered here, remnants of a civilization long forgotten. Stubborn human, Thora growled when she sensed his approach. She perched atop a crumbling stone arch, her form eerily beautiful against the silver mist. You should be safe in your village. And you should be resting that wound, he countered, climbing carefully over moss-covered stones. She leapt down with surprising grace, landing before him. The hunters have not given up. They've brought a tracker from the northern mountains. He follows scent, not sight. Then we need to leave the valley entirely. We? Her amber eyes narrowed. There is no we, healer. There is now. Lyndon set down his pack. I'm marked as your ally. 3 nights ago, the village elder came to my cottage. Someone saw me entering the forest with supplies. Thora's spines flattened against her back, a gesture he'd come to recognize as concern. What did you tell them? That I was gathering rare herbs. They didn't believe me. He pulled back his collar, revealing a branded mark on his shoulder. The penalty for aiding monsters. She hissed, anger flashing in her eyes. They marked you like cattle? It means I can't return. His voice remained steady. So you're stuck with me, unless you plan to eat me after all. For the first time, a sound almost like laughter escaped her. You'd probably taste terrible anyway. That night, sheltered in a cave behind a waterfall, Lyndon finally asked the question that had burned within him since their first meeting. What happened to you, Thora? Who cursed you, and why? The silence stretched so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she moved to the cave's mouth, staring at the silver cascade of water. I was a guardian, she began, her voice carrying a weight of centuries. One of 12 sworn to protect the sacred groves. We were not quite human, not quite spirit. Blessed by the old gods with long life and communion with the forest. The ruins in the hollow, Lyndon realized. That was your home. She nodded. For 300 years, I walked these lands in human form, guiding the balance between your kind and the wild. Until the sorcerer came. Valerian, she continued, the name like venom on her tongue. He sought the heart tree, the source of the forest's power. We refused him. So he waited, patient as only the truly evil can be. One by one, my kin fell to his schemes. Betrayed, poisoned, turned against each other. Her claws scraped against stone. I was the last. He couldn't kill me, our life force was bound to the forest itself. So instead, he twisted the magic, corrupted the bond. He made you into what they would fear most, Lyndon whispered. Yes. This form, it reflects the terror in human hearts, not my true nature. With each passing year, I lose more of myself to it. Her eyes met his, vulnerable for the first time. The attacks on villages, I don't mean to harm. But the hunger comes, and with it, rage I cannot always control. You said he sought the heart tree. Does it still exist? It stands in the deepest part of Shadow Vale, hidden from mortal eyes. But it withers without its guardians. And I. She looked down at her clawed hands. I cannot approach it in this form. The corruption would spread to the heart itself. Lyndon moved closer, daring to place a hand on her scaled arm. Then we find a way to break the curse. There is no we, she repeated, but with less conviction than before. There is now, Lyndon insisted. I'm a healer. This is just a different kind of healing. Dawn found them poring over Lyndon's books, searching for any mention of corrupted nature magic. Thora's knowledge, centuries deep, filled gaps in his understanding. Together, they began to forge a plan, find the sorcerer's grimoire, rumored to be hidden in the ruins, and use his own magic against him. What neither realized was that while they sought a cure, the hunters had found Thora's trail again. And this time, they brought with them something deadlier than weapons, a fragment of the heart tree itself, twisted and corrupted, that called to the beast within her like a siren song. The hunters moved through Shadow Vale like a plague, methodical, relentless, poisoning the forest with their presence. Their leader, Commander Thorvald, had slain 18 so-called monsters across the realm, his scarred face a testament to battles barely survived. At his side walked Fenris, the tracker from the northern mountains, a wiry man with eyes that never blinked and nostrils that flared constantly, sampling the air. The beast passed here, Fenris murmured, crouching to examine disturbed earth. And it was not alone. Thorvald frowned. The villagers mentioned a renegade healer. You smell him too? Yes. Their trails are intertwined. Fenris lifted a curious object, a small bundle of herbs tied with thread. He treats her wounds. Interesting. Traitor to his kind, spat one of the younger hunters. Thorvald's expression remained cold. No matter. We have what will draw the monster to us. He gestured to the wooden box carried by two men at the rear of their party. Even closed, an eerie green light seeped through its seams. By nightfall, we'll have our prey. Miles away, Lyndon and Thora explored the deepest chambers of the ruins, searching for Valerian's hidden grimoire. The underground passages twisted like a labyrinth, walls covered in ancient symbols that glowed faintly at Thora's approach. These were our sacred texts, she explained, tracing clawed fingers over the luminescent runes. Teachings passed from the forest itself. Lyndon studied the patterns, noticing how they changed when Thora touched them. The magic still recognizes you, despite the curse. Part of me remains untainted, she agreed. A spark of my true self, buried deep. They descended further, until they reached a chamber where crystal formations erupted from floor and ceiling, meeting in the center like clasped hands. Here, the air itself seemed to pulse with ancient power. The heart chamber, Thora whispered, her voice tinged with reverence and sorrow. Where we communed with the forest spirit. Lyndon watched in awe as the crystals brightened at her presence, casting rainbow fragments across the stone walls. For a moment, Thora's form seemed to shimmer, scales briefly replaced by smooth skin, before returning to their cursed state. It remembers you, he said softly. Thora's eyes closed in pain. A ghost of memory. Nothing more. As they searched the chamber, Lyndon discovered a hollow behind one crystal formation. Inside lay a book bound in what appeared to be bark, its pages made of pressed leaves rather than paper. This isn't Valerian's grimoire, he said, carefully opening it. This is something older. Thora approached, her massive form casting shadows across the illuminated chamber. The Guardian's Codex, she breathed. I thought it lost forever. They pored over the ancient text together, Thora translating the forgotten language. The Codex spoke of the Guardian's creation, the binding of their spirits to the heart tree, and, most crucially, the ritual to purify corrupted magic. The countercurse requires 3 elements, Thora explained, hope coloring her voice for the first time. Water from the sacred spring, which still flows beneath this chamber. Ash from the heart tree itself. And... She hesitated. And? Lyndon prompted. Blood freely given by one who sees with true sight, one who perceives the heart beneath the curse. Their eyes met in the crystal light. My blood, Lyndon said, understanding immediately. Suddenly, Thora stiffened, her spines rising along her back. Something's wrong, she growled, sniffing the air. The forest, it screams. Before Lyndon could respond, a wave of pain dropped Thora to her knees. Her form began to shift, scales rippling, claws lengthening. The rational light in her eyes dimmed, replaced by feral rage. Thora. Lyndon rushed to her side. What's happening? Through clenched teeth, she managed, heart tree fragment, corrupted, they're using it, to call the beast within me. Understanding dawned horribly. The hunters found a piece of the heart tree. They're using it to control you. Run, she gasped, fighting the compulsion with all her strength. I cannot resist much longer. Instead, Lyndon grabbed the codex in his satchel. We need to complete the ritual now. Fight it, Thora. Focus on my voice. Working frantically, he collected water from the crystal spring that bubbled in the chamber's center. The second ingredient, ash from the heart tree, seemed impossible to obtain now. But as Thora writhed in agony, an idea struck him. The corruption calls to the corruption within you, he said, kneeling beside her. But your true self still exists. You said a spark remains untainted. With trembling hands, he cut his palm, letting blood drip into the spring water. My blood, freely given, by one who sees your true heart. As the final drop fell, Thora's struggle intensified. Above them, they could hear the hunters entering the ruins, Fenris's voice calling out as he tracked them to the heart chamber. "It's not enough," Thora groaned. "Without the ash." Linden looked at her with sudden clarity. "You are of the heart tree. Its essence flows in you, corrupted but present." Taking a deep breath, he pressed his bleeding hand against her chest, directly over her heart. "Let my blood reach that untainted spark." For one terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, as the hunter's footsteps echoed down the passage toward them, the crystals in the chamber blazed with blinding light. Light erupted from Thora's body, radiating outward in waves of emerald and sapphire. The crystals in the heart chamber amplified it, creating a dazzling storm that forced Linden to shield his eyes. Through fingers spread against the brilliance, he saw Thora's form contort, shifting, shrinking, the scales receding like tide from shore. The hunters burst into the chamber just as the light reached its zenith, their weapons drawn. Commander Thorvald raised his crossbow, aiming at the transforming figure. "Stop!" Linden cried, throwing himself between the hunters and Thora. "She's not what you think." "Stand aside, traitor," Thorvald growled. "That creature has terrorized these lands for years." The light finally dimmed, revealing Thora collapsed on the chamber floor. Her form was changed, still not fully human, but no longer the terrifying beast of legend. She stood a head taller than Linden, her skin a pale blue with scattered scales that caught the crystal light like sapphires. Her eyes remained amber, but now held unmistakable intelligence and weariness. "By the gods," whispered one of the younger hunters. "What is she?" "I am Guardian," Thora said, her voice melodic yet rough from years of disuse. "Last of the 12 bound to protect this forest." Fenris, the tracker, stepped forward, nostrils flaring. His eyes widened with recognition. "She speaks truth. I smell ancient magic, not corruption." He turned to Thorvald. "This is no ordinary monster." Thorvald's grip on his crossbow didn't waver. "Pretty words don't erase the deaths she's caused." "I have taken no human life," Thora countered, steadying herself against a crystal formation. "The destruction I caused, I cannot excuse. The curse twisted my purpose, my very nature. But I fought it, always." Linden moved to support her, his bleeding hand leaving red prints on her arm. "The sorcerer Valerian cursed her centuries ago, corrupting her bond with the heart tree. We've started the purification, but it's incomplete. We care nothing for ancient feuds," Thorvald declared, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. From behind, the hunter carrying the wooden box cried out in pain. The box had begun to glow from within, the corrupted heart tree fragment responding to the purification magic. The lid burst open, revealing a twisted, blackened shard pulsing with sickly green light. "The corruption spreads," Thora said urgently. "That fragment must be cleansed before it poisons the entire forest." As if summoned by her words, roots erupted from the chamber floor, wrapping around the wooden box. The hunters backed away in alarm as more roots broke through stone, twisting toward the center of the chamber. "The heart tree awakens," Thora whispered in awe. "It senses the purification." Thorvald, ever practical even in the face of magic, lowered his crossbow slightly. "If we help you complete this ritual, will the attacks on villages stop?" "They already have," Linden answered. "The ritual has begun to break the curse that drove her to rage." The commander studied them both, decades of monster hunting warring with the evidence before his eyes. Finally, he nodded curtly. "What must be done?" Working together, healer, guardian, and hunters, they followed the ancient instructions in the codex. The corrupted fragment was placed in the center of the chamber, surrounded by crystal-infused water mixed with Linden's blood. Thora, drawing on her reawakening connection to the forest, sang in a language none of the humans understood, her voice resonating with the crystals. As the final notes of her song echoed through the chamber, the blackened fragment cracked, golden light spilling from within. The corruption dissolved like ink in water, leaving behind a translucent seed glowing with gentle radiance. A heart seed, Thora explained, wonder in her voice. The essence of the heart tree, preserved despite the corruption. With this, we can restore what was lost. The transformation of the seed seemed to affect Thorvald more deeply than anything else they had witnessed. He sheathed his weapon entirely. It seems we hunted the wrong monster. Valerian's curse was the true beast. A beast that's not fully defeated, Thora cautioned. The ritual has freed me partially, but the heart tree still withers. Without its guardians, the forest will eventually fail. Lyndon looked at her with sudden understanding. That's why you searched for the villages. You weren't just hunting for food, you were looking for those with the potential to become new guardians. Yes, she admitted. Even through the curse, I sensed my duty. The heart tree must have protectors. Commander Thorvald surprised them all by kneeling before Thora. I have spent my life hunting creatures I deemed monsters. Perhaps it's time to protect instead. He looked up, his scarred face solemn. I offer my service to the forest. One by one, the other hunters followed his example, even Fenris with his keen senses. Lyndon watched as Thora's expression shifted from disbelief to hope. In the days that followed, word spread through the villages of Shadow Vale's transformation. The monster was revealed as protector, her attacks explained, her true nature understood. Some villagers, drawn by curiosity or destiny, made pilgrimages to the ruins to meet the last guardian. Lyndon remained by Thora's side as she began training the new guardians. His healing skills proved vital as they worked to restore the heart tree's strength. The curse's effects lingered. Thora would never fully regain her original form, but with each passing day, the forest grew greener, the magic stronger. Do you regret it? Thora asked him one evening as they stood before the heart tree, now replanted in the center of the heart chamber. Casting your lot with a monster? Lyndon took her hand, still clawed, still scaled, but gentle in his grasp. I never saw a monster, he reminded her. Only a heart worth saving. Above them, the first new guardian leaves unfurled from the heart tree's branches, glowing with promise in the twilight.